Hello YouTube. This is part 4 of my Knife Basics video series, and this one is going to cover the parts of fixed blade knife handles. Now, it is a handle and not a hilt, and I know some people use the term hilt, and I've probably done it myself from time to time. But technically a hilt is part of a sword, so when you're talking about knives, it's a handle. And unlike folders, where it's part of the blade, the first part of a fixed blade knife handle is the tang. And if this is the spine of the knife, which it is, then the tang is the heart of the knife. And the reason I say that is because in most cases the tang determines just how strong and durable a fixed blade is. And in some cases the tang is actually the entire handle, as on this old super thrower I've had. Well, I've had this knife since the 1980s, and I wish I could find more of them. It looks like one of those cheap Bud K throwers, but this one is actually much higher quality. And I've been looking for more of them for years, but I don't know, they don't seem to make them like this anymore. Oh well. Anyway, you can see that the tang is the handle with nothing else attached. And this is as simple as a knife blade, or knife handle rather, can get. My bad. Okay, and some tang handles are skeletonized, like on this Tekna diving knife, which also makes them very light. So, tang handles are very slim and very light, but there's not really much to hold on to, so these knives are not very comfortable to use. Even on this Kershaw Amphibian, which has some rubber molded around the inside of the skeletonized tang, it's not very comfortable to use for long periods because the top and the bottom of the tang are still exposed. So, to improve the gripability, is that a word, of a knife handle, material is added to the basic tang to make it thicker, and the easiest way to do that is just to simply wrap the handle in either leather or some kind of nylon like paracord, and you can see how that's done on this super thrower. And this does improve the handle a lot, but it's not optimal, as wrapped handles tend to either fray or come unraveled, or in the case of leather they could even rot. So going from a basic wrap, fixed blade knife handles start to get more complex. And the next step up is to actually attach some kind of material to the sides of the tang. And you can see how that's done very clearly on this Boccarchans. And these pieces are called scales. And scales can be made of many things: wood, plastic, bone, antler, ivory, rubber, other synthetics like micarta, Zytel, G10, Grivory. Anything that's hard enough can actually be used as a knife scale. And the cool thing about scales is that they leave the tang visible. And when a tang that has other material attached to it, but it still runs all the way to the butt of the blade, or the butt of the handle rather, it's called a full tang. And full tang knives are definitely desirable because they're strong. And once the handle material completely covers the tang, making it a hidden tang like on this Victorinox paring knife, it's hard to tell whether or not you have a full tang. And the next step up from scales is to actually cover the tang in handle material. And like scales, handle materials can be made from many different things. Again, leather, wood, rubber, staghorn, synthetics, or even silver, as in the case of this Oneida steak knife that my wife is missing. And I'll have to make sure she gets that back, or I'll be hearing about it. And hidden tangs covered in handle material make the most comfortable handles, especially if they're designed well. But as I said, once the tang is completely covered, it's hard to tell if it's a full tang or not. And it could be a partial tang, like on this old hickory knife. You can see the tang only extends about halfway down through that handle. Now, partial tangs aren't necessarily bad, and they're often more than adequate for their intended purpose, but a partial tang puts a lot more stress on the handle material, especially during lateral stresses, and that could cause the material to break and the handle to fail. So if a knife is intended for hard use, as in bushcraft or combat, a full tang is always better than a partial tang. But as I said, if a knife is just for kitchen or general utility use, then a partial tang is usually just fine, like on the Victorinox paring knife and the roach belly. But whether or not a tang is full or partial, it still needs to be substantial enough not to break. And some cheap knives really skimp on the tang, and what's under the handle could be just a little piece of rat tail metal. Now, I don't have a knife that I can demonstrate this on, but I think this will work just fine. If this were a knife, you could tell it has a good blade and a beefy handle, but what's underneath is this little rat tail, and that could break. And in the best case scenario, that would just be inconvenient, and in the worst case scenario, that could be very dangerous and actually injure you. So the tang is important, and unfortunately you can't always tell how good a tang is under handle material. So if you're buying a knife for hard use or self-defense, you need to research the specifications to see what kind of tang it has. And most quality knife makers will actually list that information on their websites, and many of the online dealers have it posted also. And if you can't find it in either of those places, it's a good idea to check on knife forums, especially if the manufacturer has their own forum. And the bottom line is just this: if a knife isn't well known and doesn't have a good reputation, if you can't find the specs on it, it is not a good idea to trust your life to it. Okay, the next part found on some fixed blade handles is the cross guard, or the quillions. And some people call these guards, but that's not quite right. Technically, a guard is something that guards your hand from an enemy's blade, so it would need to cover your hand somehow. And quillions are really too small to reliably stop another blade. But what they do is they prevent your hand from sliding down onto the blade. And they can either be one-sided or two-sided. So basically, a guard protects your hand from another blade, and a quillion protects your hand from your own blade. Now, you could try to use a quillion as a guard. You could get lucky. More likely you're just going to end up losing some fingers, so good luck with that. And some knives have a rear quillion on the tail, on the butt of the knife, which is basically just a hook which prevents the knife from sliding out of your hand on that end. And some blades have quillions that are integrated into the tang, like the Bokershans, the Techna diving knife, and the Kershaw amphibian. Other quillions or guards are integrated into the handle material, like on the Peacekeeper 1. And on some knives, like the Air Force Survival Knife, the USMC K-Bar, and this Valor boot knife, it's actually a separate piece that slides up the tang to the ricasso and is held in place by the handle material. And some quillions, like on the Valor, also act as what's known as a bolster. And what bolsters do is they add metal to the start of the tang, where the knife is most likely to come under heavy lateral stress. And that makes it much stronger right behind the ricasso. And the Boker Schanz, which is actually made out of one solid piece of metal, has integral bolsters. But in most cases, bolsters are either slid over the tang or they're pinned to the side of it, just right behind the ricasso. Okay, and hidden tangs can be attached to the handle in a couple of different ways. First, the tang could have a series of notches or holes in it, and the handle material is actually then just molded to it, as in the case of the Victorinox, the Roach Belly, and Peacekeeper 1. Or, the butt end of the tang could be rounded and threaded, and a part known as a pommel is screwed onto it, holding it all together. And the pommel on this Air Force survival knife is just a simple nut. And the pommel on the Valor is a threaded cap. And pommel is another frequently misused word. If an exposed full tang has metal protruding past the scales, that is not a pommel. It's a skull crusher. And there's a difference. A pommel holds the knife together, and a skull crusher is actually an extension of the tang. And you could probably use a pommel to crush a skull, but there's still a difference. If it doesn't screw on, it's not a pommel. Okay, it's a skull crusher. You know, there's one more type of fixed blade knife handle I want to mention, and that's the hollow handle, like you can see on this Bowie Bushman from Cold Steel. And in this case, they leave the tang material very wide, and then they just roll it around and weld it to make the tube. And Cold Steel does that so that you can put this knife on a stick and make a spear out of it. You can see I'm currently modifying it to actually make that a compartment to hold some basic supplies. But there are some so-called survival knives out there that just have a tube attached to what's usually a very short tang, and those knives are just crap. Here's my rule of thumb. If it has a compass in the handle, don't even look at it. Find something else. Okay, so that pretty much covers fixed blade knife handles, and the next one's going to cover folding knife handles. So check back for that, and as always, thanks for watching.